Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, the podcast where we explore the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. I'm James Carrington, and today we're traveling to one of the most remote mountain ranges in Siberia. In 1993, 7 experienced hikers entered the Khamar-Daban wilderness, expecting a challenging but carefully planned expedition. Within days, 6 of them were dead after collapsing in rapid succession and displaying frightening, inexplicable symptoms. Was it a terrible case of exposure and hypothermia, or did something far more unusual happen? The Khamar-Daban range stretches across southern Siberia, rising along the southern edge of Lake Baikal in what is now the Russian Republic of Buryatia. Although its elevations are modest compared with ranges such as the Himalayas or the Alps, Khamar-Daban can be extraordinarily dangerous. Moist air from Lake Baikal collides with the mountains, producing sudden storms, heavy rainfall, and, even during the summer, bitterly cold temperatures. Thick forests cover the lower slopes, while the higher ridges are exposed to fierce winds and rapidly changing conditions. A trail that seems manageable in sunshine can become nearly impassable within hours. In the summer of 1993, an experienced hiking instructor named Lyudmila Korovina organized an expedition through this rugged landscape. 41 years old and widely respected by those who trained under her, Korovina had spent years teaching young people how to survive in remote and unforgiving terrain. She was known as a demanding leader who expected discipline, endurance, and careful preparation from her students. She did not treat hiking as a casual pastime. To Korovina, it was a serious physical and mental pursuit, and the young people who accompanied her had been trained accordingly. 6 hikers joined her on the journey: 23-year-old Alexander Krysin, 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko, 19-year-old Denis Shvachkin, 16-year-old Victoria Zalesova, 15-year-old Timur Bapanov, and 17-year-old Valentina Utochenko. Although all of them were still teenagers or young adults, they were not unfamiliar with difficult outdoor conditions. They had trained under Korovina and trusted her judgment. Whatever disagreements later emerged about the decisions made during the expedition, this was not a group of tourists who had wandered into the wilderness without preparation. The expedition was also part of a larger plan. Korovina was leading one group through Khamar-Daban, while another group, which reportedly included her daughter, was following a separate route. The 2 parties intended to meet at a predetermined location later in the journey. Their routes would take them through forests, river valleys, and exposed high ground, before eventually bringing them back toward civilization. It was an ambitious itinerary, but one Korovina apparently believed her students were fully capable of completing. The hikers began their journey at the beginning of August. For the first several days, there was no sign that anything was seriously wrong. They moved through the taiga, carrying tents, sleeping bags, food, and the other equipment required for a multi-day expedition. Conditions, however, gradually deteriorated. Rain swept across the mountains, temperatures fell, and the group's clothing and equipment became increasingly damp. The combination of physical exertion, inadequate rest, and relentless exposure would later become central to the official explanation for what happened. According to later accounts, Korovina maintained a demanding pace despite the worsening weather. Supporters of her methods argued that she was an accomplished instructor who understood the region and knew how to keep her students moving. Critics questioned whether the group had been pushed too hard and whether they should have descended sooner. Because only one member survived, and because many details were recorded after she had endured severe physical and emotional trauma, reconstructing every decision made during those days has proved difficult. By August 4th, the group had reached an exposed area at an elevation of more than 6,500 feet. Instead of descending into the relative shelter of the forest, they established camp on or near an open ridge. There were few natural barriers to shield them from the wind, and the weather continued to batter the mountains. Rain reportedly mixed with sleet or snow, soaking clothing and reducing visibility. Even in August, the temperature at that altitude could fall dangerously low, particularly when combined with powerful wind and wet equipment. Why the group remained in such an exposed location has become one of the tragedy's enduring questions. They may have been too tired to continue safely. Korovina may have believed that moving through poor visibility would be more dangerous than staying where they were. It's also possible that the precise location and severity of their camp have been exaggerated as the story was retold. Much of the information available in English comes from later summaries rather than complete public investigative files, and some widely repeated details differ from one account to another. What appears clear is that the hikers spent a miserable night exposed to cold, wind, and moisture. Their supplies were limited, their bodies were exhausted, and at least some members of the group may already have been suffering from the early stages of hypothermia. In such conditions, judgment can deteriorate long before a person realizes how much danger they're in. Confusion, poor coordination, and irrational behavior can emerge as the body's core temperature falls. But what Valentina Utachenko later described was far more sudden and far more terrifying than a gradual decline. On the morning of August 5th, the group began preparing to leave the campsite. They had survived the night, and the logical priority was to descend from the exposed ridge and reach the protection of the forest below. The hikers broke camp and prepared to continue their descent, taking comfort in their belief that their ordeal was finally nearing an end. According to Valentina, the sole survivor, there was a little indication that catastrophe was only moments away. Then, without warning, Alexander Kresin suddenly cried out and collapsed. What happened next has puzzled investigators for more than 3 decades, as within minutes, the mountain descended into total chaos. Valentina later recalled that Alexander appeared to be in severe physical distress. He reportedly clutched at his throat and chest, as though he could no longer breathe. Blood was said to be coming from his nose and ears, and he began convulsing violently on the ground. The symptoms were so sudden and so alarming that the rest of the group initially struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Had he suffered a seizure? Was he experiencing a medical emergency? Or had something in the environment triggered a catastrophic reaction? Lyudmila Korovina immediately rushed to Alexander's side, attempting to help her student. But before anyone could make sense of what was happening, another member of the group collapsed. Then another. Within minutes, what had begun as a single medical emergency had become a nightmare. Valentina would later describe the scene as complete chaos, with members of the expedition running in different directions, screaming, falling to the ground, and displaying bizarre behavior that seemed entirely out of character. According to her account, several hikers tore at their clothing despite the freezing temperatures, a behavior that has sometimes been associated with the advanced stages of hypothermia, although it can also occur in other forms of severe physiological distress. Others reportedly appeared disoriented, unable to communicate clearly or coordinate their movements. One after another, they fell silent. Valentina herself was overwhelmed by confusion and fear. She later said she could not understand why her friends were dying so quickly or what danger, if any, might also threaten her. Surrounded by collapsing companions and unable to help them, she made the agonizing decision to leave the area. It was a choice that has occasionally been questioned by those unfamiliar with survival situations, but investigators generally agreed that remaining on the exposed mountainside would likely have claimed another life. Alone in one of the most isolated regions of Siberia, Valentina descended into the forest below, hoping that lower elevations would provide shelter from the relentless wind and rain. She eventually found refuge near a small stand of trees, where she spent the night in miserable conditions, with only the equipment she had managed to carry. She had no reliable way to contact rescuers, no certainty about where she was, and no way of knowing whether anyone else from the expedition had survived. The following day, Valentina cautiously made her way back toward the campsite, hoping against hope that someone might still be alive. Instead, she found a scene that would remain with her for the rest of her life. The bodies of her companions lay scattered across the mountainside, exactly where they had fallen. Lyudmila Korovina was among the dead. In less than 24 hours, an experienced expedition leader and 6 young hikers had been reduced to a single survivor standing alone in the Siberian wilderness. Knowing she could do nothing more for her friends, Valentina gathered what supplies she could and continued making her way through the mountains. She navigated rivers, dense forest, and rugged terrain by herself, relying on the survival skills Korovina had taught her. After 4 harrowing days alone in the Siberian wilderness, Valentina was finally rescued by a group of Ukrainian kayakers rafting down the Snezhnaya River. They brought the traumatized teenager to the nearest police station, where the alarm was finally raised. News of the tragedy stunned the local hiking community. Experienced outdoor enthusiasts understood that accidents in remote mountains were always possible, but the sudden deaths of 6 people from the same expedition, combined with the survivors' extraordinary description of their final moments, suggested that this had been no ordinary wilderness accident. As rescue teams began recovering the bodies and investigators started asking questions, they hoped the physical evidence would provide a straightforward explanation. Instead, it raised even more questions. In the days that followed, search teams entered the Khamar-Daban mountains to locate the missing hikers. The rugged terrain and unpredictable weather complicated the effort, but eventually the bodies of the 6 victims were recovered from the mountainside. The scene appeared to support Valentina's account that the group had died within a relatively small area after a sudden and catastrophic chain of events. There was no evidence that they had become separated over many miles, nor were there signs of violence or any indication that another person had been involved. The autopsies revealed a number of troubling findings, but they did not provide the kind of clear-cut answer investigators had hoped for. Officials ultimately concluded that the hikers had died from hypothermia with the severe weather, exhaustion, and prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions playing the central role. In other words, the expedition had encountered a deadly combination of environmental factors that gradually overwhelmed the group. Yet critics of the official conclusion have long argued that it fails to fully explain the survivors' description of the victims' final moments, particularly the reports of sudden collapse, convulsions, bleeding, and apparently irrational behavior. One explanation put forward by some physicians and outdoor experts is that extreme exposure can produce far more complex medical emergencies than many people realize. Severe hypothermia can impair judgment, coordination, and speech, while prolonged physical exertion may contribute to cardiac problems, pulmonary edema, or cerebral edema in susceptible individuals. Wet clothing, powerful winds, inadequate nutrition, and accumulated fatigue can create a cascade of medical complications that develops far more rapidly than most hikers would expect. Another theory suggests the hikers may have accidentally eaten poisonous mushrooms they had foraged that morning. Because their leader was an experienced forager who taught her students to identify edible mushrooms, some believe a deadly species may have been mistaken for a safe one. But there's no evidence that this actually happened, and the rapid onset of the hikers' symptoms has led many experts to question whether mushroom poisoning alone could explain the tragedy. Others have wondered whether the group could have been exposed to some other environmental toxin. Various suggestions have included contaminated water, naturally occurring gases, or even toxins produced by algae or fungi. To date, however, no convincing evidence has emerged to support any of these possibilities. Likewise, suggestions that the hikers encountered secret military testing, classified weapons, or some unknown external force remain entirely speculative and are not supported by the available investigative record. Some researchers have proposed that a combination of factors, rather than a single cause, may offer the most realistic explanation. A physically exhausted group, soaked by days of cold rain and exposed to powerful winds at high elevation, may have reached a point where even a relatively minor medical crisis involving one hiker triggered panic and a rapid breakdown of the entire expedition. In such circumstances, impaired judgment, disorientation, and the inability to provide effective aid could have transformed an already dangerous situation into an irreversible tragedy within a matter of minutes. Even today, however, certain aspects of the incident remain difficult to reconcile. Why did the first hiker become critically ill so suddenly? Were all 6 victims suffering from the same underlying condition, or did each succumb differently as the crisis unfolded? And to what extent did the trauma experienced by the sole survivor affect the way she later remembered those terrifying events? These questions have fueled decades of discussion among mountaineers, physicians, and amateur investigators alike. Unlike many famous mysteries, this tragic incident has never generated a single dramatic piece of evidence capable of changing the course of the investigation. There was no mysterious artifact, no hidden diary, no anonymous confession, and no dramatic breakthrough waiting decades to be discovered. Instead, the case has endured because it sits in the uncomfortable space between what science can explain and what human experience sometimes struggles to describe. The official findings may account for much of what happened on that windswept ridge, yet the precise sequence of events and the terrifying speed with which 6 experienced hikers lost their lives may never be known with certainty. More than 30 years later, the Khamar-Daban incident remains one of Siberia's most haunting mountain tragedies. Whether the victims were overcome by an extraordinary combination of exposure, exhaustion, and medical complications, or whether some crucial piece of the puzzle has simply been lost to time, their story continues to remind us how quickly nature can turn unforgiving and how even experienced adventurers can find themselves confronting circumstances beyond their understanding. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Echoes of the Unknown. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with fellow mystery lovers. Your support helps us continue exploring the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries, one story at a time. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some mountains never give up all their secrets.